The fight that nearly killed Michael Watson and changed British boxing forever. The night Britain held its breath. The date was Saturday, 21st September 1991. The venue was White Hart Lane, home of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. The event was billed as one of the most anticipated rematches in British boxing history. Michael Watson versus Chris Eubank for the WBO super middleweight title. What unfolded that night would become a watershed moment that exposed the dangerous inadequacies of boxing safety protocols and forever altered the sport in the United Kingdom. Michael Watson was 26 years old, a supremely skilled middleweight from Islington, North London. He'd grown up in a tough neighbourhood, but had channeled his energy into boxing, developing a reputation as a technically excellent fighter with genuine championship potential. His record stood at an impressive 21 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw. But what defined Watson wasn't just his skill, it was his intelligence in the ring and his unwavering determination. Chris Eubank, by contrast, was the flamboyant champion. Born in Dulwich, he'd spent part of his youth in New York before returning to Britain to pursue boxing. By 1991, he was undefeated in his professional career, holding multiple titles and cultivating a persona that mixed arrogance with genuine charisma. Eubank wore jodhpurs and carried a cane to press conferences. He spoke with an affected accent and treated boxing as theatre. But beneath the showmanship was a genuinely world-class fighter. The two had fought once before, in June 1991 at Earl's Court. That bout had been intensely competitive, with Watson arguably doing enough to win. But the judges had awarded a narrow decision to Eubank, retaining his WBO middleweight title. The decision was controversial, leaving Watson and his supporters feeling robbed. The rematch was inevitable. For the second fight, the stakes were raised. Eubank had moved up to super middleweight and captured the WBO title in that division. Watson, despite the bitter disappointment of the first fight's result, had trained with obsessive focus. His trainer, Jimmy Tibbs, had developed a tactical approach designed to neutralize Eubank's strengths whilst exploiting his weaknesses. Watson entered the ring not as a reckless challenger seeking revenge, but as a disciplined professional determined to prove he was the better fighter. From the opening bell, Watson implemented his game plan perfectly. He controlled the center of the ring, worked behind a solid jab, and picked his shots carefully. Eubank, usually dominant and imposing, seemed frustrated, unable to establish his rhythm. Watson was outboxing the champion, making him look ordinary in stretches. The crowd, 18,000 strong, sensed they were witnessing something special, the systematic dismantling of a previously unbeatable fighter. Round after round, Watson's confidence grew. By the middle rounds, even Eubank's corner seemed concerned. Their fighter was being outthought and outworked. Watson wasn't just competing, he was winning, clearly, convincingly. The dream of finally defeating Eubank and claiming a world title was materializing. The 11th round began with Watson still controlling the action. Then, midway through, he landed a clean right hand that caught Eubank perfectly. The champion's legs buckled and he went down, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The referee began counting as Eubank took a knee, his composure shaken for the first time in his professional career. White Hart Lane erupted. Watson's supporters believed the end was near. Their man had dropped the unbeatable champion. One more sustained assault, one more combination, and the fight would be over. Watson would be world champion. But Eubank rose, he beat the count, and the referee allowed the fight to continue. In the final seconds of that 11th round, Eubank, fighting on instinct and desperation, launched a counterattack. He caught Watson with an uppercut, a single perfectly timed shot that snapped Watson's head back violently. Watson's neck struck the ring ropes with terrible force, the whiplash effect amplifying the trauma. Watson didn't go down immediately. He remained standing, which in boxing's culture of toughness is often mistaken for being fit to continue. The bell rang, ending the round. Both fighters returned to their corners. But something fundamental had changed. Something catastrophic had occurred that wasn't immediately visible to those watching. Watson's corner worked on him between rounds. Water, advice, encouragement. But later testimony would reveal that Watson was already showing signs of serious distress. His speech was slurred. His eyes weren't focusing properly. The neurological damage had begun. The question that would haunt British boxing for years was already forming. Should the fight have been stopped right then? Should the ringside doctor have intervened? Should someone, anyone, have recognized that Watson was no longer defending himself, but was instead suffering a catastrophic brain injury? The answer, tragically, was yes. But the 12th round began anyway. Michael Watson answered the bell and walked towards the center of the ring. He would never be the same again. The collapse that changed everything. The 12th round of the Michael Watson versus Chris Eubank fight began at approximately 10:54 p.m. on 21st September 1991. What followed in those final 3 minutes exposed failures so profound that they would eventually lead to legal action, public outcry, and fundamental reform of British boxing safety standards. Watson moved towards Eubank, but his movements were no longer crisp and calculated. They were labored, uncoordinated. His defensive reflexes, which had protected him brilliantly for 11 rounds, were absent. His eyes, witnesses would later testify, seemed vacant, tracking nothing, seeing nothing. To anyone who understood the neurological signs of brain trauma, Watson was exhibiting classic symptoms of catastrophic injury. Eubank, operating on the instinct of a fighter who senses vulnerability, pressed forward. He landed punches that Watson would normally have slipped or blocked easily. Watson's head snapped back with each blow, but he didn't defend himself properly. He was standing, but he wasn't fighting. The referee, Roy Francis, watched as the assault continued. 37 seconds into the round, Francis finally stepped in and stopped the fight. Eubank had retained his title by technical knockout. The champion raised his arms in victory, but the celebration was muted, perfunctory. Something felt wrong. Watson staggered, his legs unsteady. Then he collapsed. Not the theatrical fall of a fighter who's been knocked out and will recover after a few moments. This was different, a neurological shutdown, the body's systems failing as the brain swelled inside the skull. Watson lay unconscious on the canvas as the jubilation of Eubank's victory died instantly. The crowd fell silent. The commentators' voices dropped to hushed concern. In the ring, panic began to spread. And this is where the tragedy deepened into something far worse, a systemic failure that transformed a boxing injury into a life-threatening catastrophe. There were no paramedics stationed at ringside. The British Boxing Board of Control's protocols at the time did not require dedicated emergency medical personnel with advanced trauma training at every fight. There was a doctor present, but not one specifically equipped or positioned to handle catastrophic brain injury with the speed such injuries demand. There was no oxygen immediately available, no spinal board, no rapid response protocol for suspected head trauma. Watson remained lying in the ring as precious minutes ticked away, minutes during which his brain was swelling, pressure building inside his skull, damage accumulating with every second of delay. The ambulance that should have been waiting at the venue had to be summoned. It was not on site, ready to depart immediately. Even after it arrived at White Hart Lane, there was confusion about which hospital had the neurosurgical capability to treat Watson's injuries. The nearest facility, North Middlesex Hospital, was only minutes away but lacked the specialist equipment needed. Instead, the ambulance was diverted to St. Bartholomew's Hospital in central London, a journey that took additional critical time. In total, nearly 30 minutes elapsed between Watson's collapse and his arrival at a hospital capable of treating him. 30 minutes, an eternity when the brain is deprived of proper oxygen flow. when intracranial pressure is mounting, when every second increases the likelihood of permanent damage or death. At St. Bartholomew's Hospital, emergency neurosurgeons examined Watson and immediately recognized the severity of his condition. He had suffered a subdural hematoma, bleeding between the brain and skull, complicated by severe brain swelling. The pressure inside his skull was reaching fatal levels. Watson was rushed into emergency surgery. The first operation removed a blood clot pressing on his brain, but the damage was extensive and the swelling continued. Over the following days, Watson underwent 5 more brain surgeries as doctors fought desperately to save his life. His skull was opened repeatedly to relieve pressure, remove additional clots, and manage the ongoing trauma. Michael Watson slipped into a coma. Days became weeks. His family kept vigil, praying, hoping, unable to do anything but wait. The doctors offered cautious, carefully worded updates that translated to brutal truth. Watson might not survive, and if he did, the brain damage might be so severe that the life he'd known was over. The boxing world watched in horror. The media demanded answers. How could this have happened? Why wasn't proper medical care immediately available? Who was responsible for the delays that turned a serious injury into a potential death sentence? Chris Eubank, who'd celebrated victory for only seconds before realizing something was terribly wrong, was devastated. In the days following the fight, he visited Watson's family, attended prayer vigils, and spoke publicly about his anguish. The flamboyance that had defined his public persona evaporated. Eubank would later describe the psychological burden of that night as something he'd carry forever. The image of Watson collapsing, the knowledge that his punch had caused the injury, the guilt that no rational explanation could fully absolve. The British Boxing Board of Control faced intense scrutiny. Questions were asked in Parliament. Medical experts condemned the inadequate safety protocols. The contrast between the elaborate promotion of the fight, the television coverage, the 18,000 paying spectators, the millions of pounds changing hands, and the complete absence of basic emergency medical preparedness was damning. After 40 days, Michael Watson emerged from his coma, but the relief was tempered by the devastating reality of his condition. He had survived, but at a cost that would define the rest of his life. Survival, reform, and a life redefined. Michael Watson woke from his 40-day coma to discover he'd lost almost everything he'd spent his life building. The elite athlete who'd controlled a boxing ring with precision and intelligence now faced the most basic challenges of existence. He couldn't walk without assistance. His speech was severely impaired. His left side was partially paralyzed. The brain damage was permanent and profound. The rehabilitation was brutal. Physiotherapy sessions that pushed him to the edge of his endurance just to accomplish movements that most people take for granted. Speech therapy to regain the ability to communicate. Occupational therapy to relearn how to feed himself, dress himself, manage daily tasks that required coordination his damaged brain could no longer easily provide. Watson approached this new fight with the same determination he'd brought to boxing, but progress was measured in millimeters rather than miles. His family became his support system. His mother, Joan, and his siblings devoted themselves to his care. Friends from the boxing community rallied around him. But Watson's independence, the quality that had defined him as a fighter, was gone. He would never fight again. He would never fully recover. The life he'd known ended that night at White Hart Lane. In 2001, a decade after the fight, Watson took legal action against the British Boxing Board of Control, arguing that their negligence had directly contributed to the severity of his injuries. The case went to trial, and the evidence was damning. Medical experts testified that the delay in treatment had worsened Watson's outcome significantly. the absence of ringside emergency protocols, the lack of immediate oxygen, the failure to have an ambulance on site. These weren't oversights, but systemic failures that had predictable and devastating consequences. In 2001, the High Court ruled in Watson's favor, awarding him substantial damages. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. The British Boxing Board of Control had failed in its duty of care, and that failure had cost Watson dearly. The board's insurance paid out, but more importantly, the verdict forced British boxing to confront its inadequacies. The reforms that followed were comprehensive and overdue. New regulations made it mandatory for every boxing event to have an ambulance on site, positioned for immediate departure. Ringside doctors with specific training in head trauma were required. Oxygen and advanced resuscitation equipment had to be immediately available. Protocols for stopping fights at the first sign of serious neurological symptoms were strengthened. The casual approach to fighter safety that had characterized British boxing for generations was replaced with standards that, whilst they could never eliminate all risk, dramatically reduced the likelihood of another Watson-level catastrophe. These changes spread beyond Britain. Boxing organizations worldwide examined their own protocols and implemented similar reforms. Michael Watson's tragedy became a catalyst for global improvement in fighter safety. The price he paid, his health, his career, his independence, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to the same negligence he'd experienced. In 2003, more than a decade after the fight that nearly killed him, Michael Watson achieved something extraordinary. He completed the London Marathon. It took him 6 days, walking with leg braces and the support of friends, covering 26.2 miles through pain and exhaustion that would have broken most people. He crossed the finish line to enormous applause, having raised over $250,000 for the Brain and Spine Foundation. The achievement was a statement. I am still here. I still matter. My life has value beyond what I lost. Watson's courage inspired millions. He became a symbol not just of boxing's dangers, but of human resilience. He appeared at public events, speaking, slowly and with difficulty, but speaking about his experiences. He advocated for brain injury awareness and better medical protocols. The man who'd been written off as a vegetable after his coma proved everyone wrong through sheer force of will. Chris Eubank never fully recovered either, though his injuries were psychological rather than physical. He spoke openly about the guilt he carried, the nightmares that persisted years after the fight. Eubank continued boxing but was noticeably changed, more cautious, less willing to take risks, haunted by the knowledge of what his fists could do. When he finally retired from boxing, Eubank transitioned to mentoring young fighters, emphasizing safety and the real costs of the sport. He and Watson eventually reconciled, with Eubank visiting Watson and the two men finding a measure of peace with what had happened. Michael Watson is now in his late 50s. He still requires care and assistance with daily tasks. He still deals with the physical limitations imposed by his brain injury, but he remains an important figure in British boxing, not for what he achieved in the ring, but for what his tragedy forced the sport to become. Every fighter who competes today benefits from the reforms Watson's suffering prompted. Every life saved by better medical protocols is a testament to the price he paid. The fight on 21 September 1991 lasted 12 rounds. Its consequences have lasted decades. Michael Watson's boxing career was destroyed that night, but his legacy extends far beyond the sport. He proved that survival, whilst it cannot erase loss, can still carry profound meaning. He showed that courage exists not just in stepping into the ring, but in fighting every day to reclaim dignity and purpose from catastrophe. British boxing crossed a line that night it could never uncross. But from tragedy came progress. From negligence came reform. From one man's suffering came safety measures that have protected countless others. The night Michael Watson collapsed changed boxing forever and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to the same failures that nearly killed him.